I mean, the thing is that we all wanted to read David's book, I'm sure, but I didn't get a copy in time. In fact, I haven't got one yet, so there it is. Too late to go through that now. But listening to David, and he helpfully sent a short few lines summary, I get a sense of what the book's about, and there has been indeed defiance of the British Empire while it was being established, and in all the places he talks about, including in India. And my focus, of course, was on India in the book that is known here as An Era of Darkness, and in the rest of the world as Inglorious Empire. But what I tried to do was to talk about the entire expansion of the British across India, and I entirely agree that their motives were totally pecuniary. They first came to trade. Indeed, the first British ambassador at the court of Jahangir, 1614, Sir Thomas Roe, was very much a supplicant. They were trying somehow to get a foot in the door of this incredibly prosperous empire. They weren't. And therefore they needed to be able to trade with India. And for about 150 years that was the case. In fact, 1702, Thomas Pitt, who was governor, quote-unquote, of Madras, which at that point was just the city of Madras, purloined a precious stone from a temple. I believe it was a ruby, and the moment he successfully shipped it back to England, he could essentially afford to retire. It made him one of the richest men in the country, just one ruby. He was able to buy himself a rotten borough, buy himself a seat in Parliament, and at the same time spawn a dynasty that gave Britain 2 prime ministers later in the century out of one Madras ruby. So, I mean, the wealth that was available in India was out of all proportion to the needs of the somewhat impoverished grey, dank island off the coast of England. We're giving you English weather just to make you two feel at home, but but the truth is that that was how it began. But I will probably differ slightly from David in one thing, and that it's not all a tale of defiance. And in fact, in many ways, the story of British expansion in India is a combination of episodes of defiance and long periods of complicity on the part of the colonized. That is, that we Indians played our part in enabling British expansion, going right back to the first significant conquest of the British, which followed the Battle of Plassey, when they were able to consolidate their hold on Bengal. That was entirely financed by the Jagat Seths, who were essentially Indian moneylenders. It is said that they actually controlled as much money as the Bank of England at its peak in terms of relevant exchange rates at that time. They were very, very wealthy. They used to finance and bankroll armies and nawabs and so on, and financing the East India Company is what enabled them to actually defeat Siraj-ud-Dowlah in the Battle of Plassey and begin establishing their empire. Of course, once they'd done that, they were also very good at looting every place they conquered. And there's one notorious episode where Clive marches into the treasury of one of the minor principalities he's overcome, is dazzled by all the jewels and gold and so on available, and then later marvels at his own self-restraint at not having stolen even more than he did. I mean, that was the way in which he did it. There's a letter I found in my, which I've quoted in my book, from a young man writing to his father in the middle of the 18th century, saying that there is no place in the world for an Englishman of no particular talent or distinction to make himself a fortune, like India, working for the East India Company. So that's how it was, and I must say it continued well into the 20th century. There's a deposition in the House of Commons that I've come across by the then Foreign Secretary in the 1920s, saying there's all this cant about us being there on a civilizing mission for the good of the natives. He said this is utter twaddle. We are there. We seized India by the sword and we rule it by the yardstick, and we will continue to do so as long as we can in our interests. So let's have no illusions about this. The civilizing mission came as an ex post facto justification after the greatest or best known act of Indian defiance, which was the Great Indian Revolt of 1857, that the British tried to disparage as the mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny. It was much more than a mutiny. It was a fairly substantial insurrection right across large chunks of India, but it was put down with ruthlessness and ferocity. One particular day, 100,000 civilians were killed by the British in Delhi alone, and the numbers were bad enough, but the manner of their execution was particularly grisly. That's neither here nor there. What's happened has happened. But I'm just saying that after that big act of defiance, the British very quickly reasserted themselves, got rid of the East India Company, which in any case was largely a fiction. When the British say the British Empire only began in 1858, until then it was just a company. That's nonsense, because the company, 26% of the British Parliament owned shares in the East India Company, and the company didn't even appoint a Governor General without clearing the name through the rulers of the day, whether the Prime Minister or the monarch. So it was very much a British colonial enterprise from the start. And that particular enterprise then sought to justify itself in the language of the quote-unquote civilizing mission. The enlightenment to the benighted masses of India. Mind you, as I've chronicled in the book, the British created and presided over a large number of unnecessary famines that took at least 35 million Indian lives unnecessarily. We can talk about that if you're interested. And nonetheless, unfortunately, Indians were complicit at various levels of the system. Whether it was in saving the British, in fact, Stalin expressed some astonishment and contempt at the fact that so few Englishmen could rule over 300 million people when he was making that comment, because I think at the peak, I don't think Britain ever had more than 130,000 Britons in service in India at any one time, to rule over a population that at the time they left was about 330 million. So we had to cooperate in our own subjugation, and that's something that remains a blot on our story of defiance and resistance, if you like. Now, there were various bits of revolts and so on throughout, but I just wanted to add that corrective, because I don't think we have a totally glorious record as the subjugated to point to, even if subsequently, of course, we did finally get rid of the imperial yoke.
So can I ask you both, I know you want to